The 2025 budget was developed in a fiscally responsible manner, and it provides for funding for all the critical areas for Puerto Rico, including education, healthcare, public safety, social welfare, and economic development. It prioritizes initiatives that support the strong financial management and encourages economic growth. There are operational investments and increases to support civil service reform. These are long-term reforms to ensure that we have a workforce for Puerto Rico in the future. The 2024 elections, there's additional funding for municipalities, infrastructure, and funding expenses that were previously funded by expiring federal funds, including in the education space. And this is something that the Oversight Board has been concerned about, which is as the federal funds begin to expire, we are going to either have to cut the spending in those areas, or we're going to have to replace that with Commonwealth funding. And we're going to have to look at those individual areas, and this is the beginning of doing that. We also are enhancing funding for social programs, including funding for aging adults, mental health, early childhood resources, and prevention plan for violence. We're continuing to fund benefits for retirees and the Pension Reserve Trust. And it's important to note that pension benefits are still and will continue to be a significant portion of the Commonwealth spending as we move forward. That's why it's particularly important that we pay attention to any increases in those costs, because we are spending close to 20-25% in those areas, and we'll go through that. Debt service is also included here, and as a result of the Title III, or exiting Title III, we now have debt service payments that are affordable as we move forward. Since 2018, spending has been actively managed by the Oversight Board. Why this is important? Because if you look at this table, which goes from 2000 to 2016, 2016 being when PROMESA was enacted and the Oversight Board comes into place. Between 2000 and 2016, in each year, the government spent more than it brought in revenues, consecutively, each and every year without fail. And the question is, well, how does that actually happen? It happens when you pass a budget that may be balanced on the day you pass it, and then subsequent to that, you pass legislation and do other things that bring those budgets out of balance. So budget balance is not a point in time. Budget balance should be at the end of the year. So these numbers that are on this page for each year between 20 and 2016 reflect the audited financial statement numbers. So in the end, we may have said it was balanced when they enacted the budget, but in the end, the audited financial statements for each one of these years showed that spending actually exceeded revenues in each one of those years. Since 2018, we've been actively managing the budget. And in 2018 and 2019, we were still in Title III in relation with the Commonwealth, so we didn't actually, weren't making all of those payments. But this table is important to understand in a post-PROMESA era, what we would like to see, right, is that the budgets are balanced for the entire year and actively managed in the absence of the board. The overall budget for this year is $33 billion. $33 billion will fund all of the services for the Commonwealth. Is an additional $6 billion available to support disaster recovery efforts. You just look at this table just for illustration or just to give you perspective of the overall budget. 46% is federal funded. If you add in the $6 billion that's for disaster recovery, you actually are at over 50% federally funded, close to 55% if you add in the additional 60. But you have federal funding about 46% of the operations of the Commonwealth. The general fund is 39% at $13.1 billion, and then special revenues at 15% or $4.9 billion. The piece of the budget that the legislature appropriates and that we have been working with them on is the general fund component. That 39%, that $13.1 billion is the budget that we had sent to them. Now, the Oversight Board has been certifying budgets that we believe grow in a responsible manner. The 2025 general fund budget increases spending by a manageable 3%. The percentage growth number has to always be monitored because it has to keep in line with the growth in revenues, but also has to make sure that we are not increasing the budget in a way that creates liabilities that you can't fund into the future. So when we look at the growth rates, we're also looking at how that grows for the next 5 years in the fiscal plan, and we look beyond that. But recurring spending increases versus one-time spending increases are important, and it's also important that we're able to manage these increases into the future. If you look at this table, between 2023 and 2024, spending increased by 2.4%, and then between 2024 and 2025, which is the budget that we certified yesterday, increased by 3%. Over the 3-year period, or the 2-year period, 5.7% growth increase. In this year, there are ups and downs in the budget. So there's the net increase is 3%. There are some things that went down, some things that went up. We are not cutting programs in this budget to the extent that there's a need in those programs because we still have revenues that are growing. We're monitoring the situation going forward to ensure that the revenue stabilize, and we're starting to see, as the fiscal plan mentioned, softness in the economy throughout the country. And we're monitoring that to see what it would look like in post-2026. The bulk of the increase is in the education space, which is about 3.1%. A lot of that increase relates to transportation services. And in the education area, a lot of the spending there is also funded by federal dollars. 2025 overall budget on the general fund, as we said, is $13.1 billion. And as you can see on the top of this table, between the pension reserve trust and pensions, right, you're looking at over 20%, close to 25% of the general fund budget presently, before you get to any enhancements, is 25%. So 25% of any dollar that the general fund has right now is going to support pensions. When you take pensions and payroll together, you're looking at over 50%, close to 55% of the general fund budget is being used to support current employees and retired employees. I point that out because it's important as you start to talk about what increases you want to make. The decisions that have to be made by the government, right, is what level of support is the appropriate amount to support pensions going forward and payroll going forward. You have to fully fund it. So not fully funding it should not be an option, which is what has been done in the past. So in order to fully fund it, you're at about 25% for pensions and 28% for payroll. We are making increased investments in the payroll side as part of civil service reform, but doing that in a responsible way, deals with merit increases, right, in a way to be able to make sure that we have the skill sets, right, and the talent that you need in order to operate the government. Transfers are about 7%, and that includes the money that goes to the UPR, municipalities, and HTA, and then the operating expenses and everything else. So if you look to the right on the tables, you have education at about 19% just of the general fund, and we'll go through others, public safety, health, and then again, the biggest portion of the general fund dollars are payroll and pensions. The general fund budget includes $1 billion of investments that are aligned with the key priorities in the fiscal plan that was enacted earlier this year. On the education side, it's $432 million that goes to PRDE for staffing, operational support, infrastructure needs. We have to be very vigilant in making sure that we have dollars set aside for infrastructure, particularly at a time when we don't have access to the credit markets. So we're making sure that we are using PAYGO funding for road maintenance, health centers, water quality and fund control, and other priorities. Funding for municipalities are also included here. Particularly, there's funding for the cost share for recovery efforts this year. The municipalities are required or have about a 10% cost share on some of their projects. Some of the municipalities were not able to afford that 10% cost share. So we'll be working with Core 3 to see if the government can pick up the cost share for those municipalities. There are municipal services initiatives, and we plan to work with the central government and the municipalities to ensure that municipalities and the central government are partnering on an economic development basis as well as service delivery. Healthcare spending goes up. Funding for elections also goes up. Funding for public safety is increased, including personnel and new classes, as well as equipment and technology. And again, civil service reform, we also mentioned. When you look at the overall Commonwealth's operating funds, that includes the general fund that the legislature is appropriating and special revenue funds, which are also revenues that are generated by the Commonwealth. That is the better picture of overall spending that is under the control of the government outside of the federal funds. So that's $17.9 billion. And again, it's important to look at that. More than half of that $17.9 billion goes to education, public safety, health, and retiree-related purposes. There's an increase of $200 million over last year. And again, here you can see retiree payments and the Pension Reserve Trust amount to 25% of all of the general fund special revenue funding. And then you look at education at 14%. And these are the major areas. We're in a position now where there has been investments. All of the investments on this page are things that were worked on with the government, and the government being with the central government executive as well as the legislature. So these are all increments of funding that we have either continued this year from last year or are new. The biggest one is the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is $650 million, which continues, and that goes to over 660,000 residents. And that goes in the form of a cash payment. So it is important to recognize that because it is a significant portion of the operating funds budgets. Again, we've increased the amount of funding for Medicaid by expanding the eligibility of Medicaid to 100% of the federal poverty line. And we've extended that. Did it last year, and we're extending that again this year. So more people will be covered as a result of that expansion because we had the resources to do it. There's increased funding for various other programs here. And again, there's funding for elderly residence programs that the municipalities have been working on, and that new funding is reflected here. And again, this reflects many of the conversations that we've had, both established priorities, not of the Oversight Board, but of the Oversight Board working together with the central government and the legislature. When it comes to the University of Puerto Rico, last year, if you just look at the top of this chart, there's the overall revenues for the university is $1.252 billion in 24, and it's $1.256 billion in 25. The very top part of these bars in purple is the incremental funding that the Oversight Board had authorized in 24, $102 million, and in 25, $121 million, which is an increase. So we've increased the funding for the university. The challenge here is we want to make sure that the funding is used for certain milestones that are going to support academic excellence, support them working towards getting that money into the classroom, not just supporting the same operations as they were, not just supporting dealing with their deficits, but supporting initiatives to grow and improve. And that's something that we're going to have to work with the leadership of the university to do that. But we wanted to show this table just to make very clear that the funding for the university has increased. And if you were to look at the year before this, FY23, you'd actually see a 20% increase in the amount of general fund support for the university. When it comes to municipalities, again, the funding for municipalities has been increasing. It's important to look at the overall amount of money that goes to municipalities, not just the transfers. The transfers are a smaller portion on the bottom, but the municipalities get a significant amount, over $2 billion in transfers or revenues that go to the municipalities directly. The general fund transfer is a relatively small portion, but those dollars as well have increased this year, including relief on FMAP, the waste fund, and funding for essential services, which actually helps the municipalities that are the most economically challenged. The certified budget includes several provisions to control spending. There are existing provisions that have been in the budget most recently, right? And there are restrictions on being able to roll over funds from year to year. Those need prior approval. There's a portion of spending that's held back into the fourth quarter to make sure that there's sufficient funds at the end of the year to make payments. There are milestones that have to be met in order for funding to be unlocked. There's an emergency reserve fund, and there's usages and restrictions that are in the law. And then there's budget reclassifications that occur throughout the year, and there's requirements for reporting. Those are existing provisions. They're carried over this year. The legislature has agreed to those. In addition, this year, there was a group of bills that were passed in the final days of the legislative session. The number and the spending associated with those bills was close to $1 billion. And the legislation was passed. I don't believe they were considering what the expenditures or what the costs were of those bills. If you were to pass those bills, the result would be that the budget would be potentially out of balance immediately upon passage. We certify a budget and we go through this process with the legislature, $13.1 billion budget, and then there's a whole group of legislation that if they had passed, the budget would be immediately out of balance. So we worked with the legislature and discussed this issue, which they understood. And there was new language included in the budget that would say that if there's any legislation that would modify the purposes of the funds or require additional funds, they would need a certification of how it complies with the fiscal plan and how it would be funded in the budget in order to guarantee, again, that the first table that we showed here, that going forward, the budget is in balance on the day it passes, but also continually throughout the year. And in the event that other bills are passed, you'd have to go through this process to see how you're going to pay for them. And I believe this helps to deal with the issue that you had between 2000 and 2016. This is the first time this language has been included in the budget, and we'll see how it plays out going forward. But there was a lot of discussion with the legislature on including this language, and this was that result. Unfortunately, there was still some legislation that had passed before we could put this language in, and that legislation is law, still pending, and complicates how you balance the budget. You go to this table, this reflects about $850 million in proposed legislation that we saw at the end of June. We sent a letter to both the governor and the legislature on June 27th, reflecting that all of this legislation would bring the budget out of balance. and was also outside of our agreement on $13.1 billion budget. We've been working very closely with the legislature and the governor on the parameters of that $13.1 billion, and we included many things in the budget that were related to those discussions, things that had been prioritized. However, at the same time, these other bills were being passed on the outside of that agreement. The override, particularly of Senate Bill 644, that override happened on the 25th, well into the budget process, well past, right, any time to kind of reconfigure our budget to deal with that 300 to 535 million. And to be clear, the bills, our position on this bill and the cost estimates on this bill were not new. We had written 4 separate letters on 644, and then we wrote this letter on June 7th. That has an estimate fiscal impact of $300 to $535 million. If that bill was to be repealed, then this fiscal impact would obviously go away. But because it was done over the governor's objection, because the governor recognized actually the impact of this bill as well, which is what led to his veto. But then there was a subsequent override of the veto on the 25th, and that's something that we can't deal with in that amount of time. But there is an opportunity to cure this if the legislature was to repeal that. In addition, there were other bills that we identified in our June 27th letter that had significant fiscal impacts. And some of them are spending priorities that could be discussed. Some of them are violative of the fiscal plan, of the plan of adjustment, and there isn't a way to fix them. But I think the bigger point is a budget is an estimate of all of the revenues and all of the spending that is anticipated to occur in the fiscal year. All of it. When we put the budget together, we have an estimate of what we think the spending is going to be. If legislation is passed after that, that spends more, we are going to have to deal with that because that's not included in our estimate. And that's where it then breaks from our estimates of what the budgets are, because we can't anticipate all of the actions that are going to occur, and we'll have to try to fix that during the budget. An easy way to fix it would be to repeal it, or there's litigation that's possible. I don't know what other options they are. But this is the issue with regard to the additional spending. If all of this legislation had passed, spending instead of the responsible 3% would have gone to over 9%. The budget that we had agreed to would go from $13.1 billion to $13.9 billion, and we wouldn't have the resources to pay for it. So we would have to go back to the drawing board and figure out a new budget.